Judy Shelton has been appearing on C-SPAN since 1989. Her first visit was on Booknotes to discuss her book titled The Coming Soviet Crash. She made some predictions we'll ask her about in just a moment. During the past 33 years since her first appearance on C-SPAN, Judy Shelton has been in and out of politics. She worked for a time with 3 presidential candidates, including Bob Dole, Ben Carson, and Donald Trump. It was President Trump who nominated her to serve on the board of the Federal Reserve. Her selection to the Fed was controversial, and eventually President Joe Biden's administration withdrew her nomination in February of 2021. Judy Shelton, when you think back to what happened in February of 2021 when you were not voted on the Federal Reserve Board, what's your memory of that period?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying what my overall conclusion was. It's that it was a positive experience, but I must admit there were excruciating moments, and at times it was extremely frustrating as a process, and the way I found that my views were being presented to the public. I guess I hate to be a victim, but there were certainly times when I felt that I was treated unfairly, and I was willing to defend my views, but I didn't think I would get a fair hearing.
How much did you want to be on the Fed board in the first place?
Mixed emotions. I considered it a great honor to be nominated, and I was very grateful to the Trump administration for having the confidence in me to put my name forward. I never have characterized myself as a mainstream economist. I feel that I would have brought a scholarly and historical perspective to the meaning of having your monetary unit perform as a reliable store of value. And I was also very focused on the international consequences of the dollar being the dominant global reserve currency, and how important it would be to defend the monetary integrity of U.S. currency. I looked forward to collegial discussions. I didn't see myself as a rabble-rouser per se, but I'm also not a shrinking violet, and I know the Fed as an institution quite well. Since Greenspan was in, I was a regular visitor and had many conversations with him during his time as chairman and afterwards. I was rather close to Paul Volcker and participated regularly in conferences with him, often sitting together at international monetary forums. So I felt well versed in the personalities that were so critical in defining monetary policy and monetary theory. I felt fortunate to have had many in-depth discussions with them. And so I looked forward to bringing that background and knowledge and experience to participating myself at the monetary policy making decision meetings, the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee meetings that are held 8 times a year, plus the ongoing daily experience of working at the Fed as a governor of the Federal Reserve Board.
One of my goals is to ask you questions for the average person, me, not people that are involved in all the intricacies of the Fed, and so we can better understand it. And I wanted the audience to know also that in our C-SPAN archive, you can go watch Judy Shelton in 1989, the first interview that I did with you. You can watch the second one in 2009, 20 years later. And then now here we are 13 years later. And it's to follow up on all that and what you've said in the past some, and then this experience. Help us understand what happens to someone when they're nominated for a job like this. How long was that process?
Well, first, let me say, Brian, I never would consider you an average person. I think you're an exceptional individual, and I thank you for all you do to help illuminate these issues for all of us. And I appreciate also learning when people can break things down to a level that enables me to do so from their comments. My personal experience started while I was still serving the administration. I was in London, where I was the U.S. Director to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And that was a very demanding and fulfilling position, and I wasn't looking to change it. But at the time when the Trump administration began considering candidates for the Federal Reserve Board, I was aware my name had long been floated. And so I received a message that if I had any interest in that position, this came from Larry Kudlow, who was the head of the National Economic Council for President Trump, that I should visit the United States and make the case, and maybe I would be considered in the potential pool of candidates. I did that, went back to London. And then various people were put forward. Herman Cain was put forward. I know him quite well. I thought he would be extremely effective because he's an expert on the restaurant and service economy. And I thought, who would have better experience in informing these very high-level scholarly discussions at the Federal Reserve on the real experiences of people, especially we see now after COVID how valuable his input would have been about the employment activity and decisions people would make under COVID restrictions. He also had served at the Kansas City District Federal Reserve as chairman of their Citizen Committee. Bottom line, I thought Steve Moore, who was also put forward, would have been extremely helpful, very, very gifted economist with wonderful instincts and judgment about how you have a pro-growth economy and the role of stable money in bringing that about. But those candidates didn't go much further. I think they were treated rather brutally by the press, and then it seemed it was my turn. And I met with the president for all the press reports that I was such a close advisor. It was the one and only time during President Trump's 4-year term that I met with him in the Oval Office. And that was the same day that Chris Waller, whose name was also being put forward as a Federal Reserve potential nominee for the Board of Governors, he had a 45-minute one-on-one with the president. And then I was next. And I sat down in the Oval Office. There was a note taker. There was the president behind his desk, and then Larry Kudlow sat in a side chair. And it was an extremely business-like interview. He had my resume in front of him. He had various things I'd written in front of him. He never made any demands or suggested in any way how I would vote as a member of the committee. He just really asked about my qualifications and past experience and just overall thematic type issues. And as I left, I heard him say to his note taker, I think you can put out a tweet that lists her qualifications and that she's one of the candidates we're going to put forward. And I raced back. I'd come into D.C. to stay overnight, and my husband met me back at the hotel. And within about an hour, I saw it had been tweeted out that my name, as well as Chris Waller's name, were being put forward, tweeted out by President Trump, to be considered to join the Board of Governors. From then on, I would say I was besieged with calls from reporters. I started seeing my name on TV and in newspapers as a controversial candidate. Meantime, I went back to London and went back to my job. And the next step, I guess, was as I had to then go through the process That included another interview with the FBI, but that's what you have to do. And I'd already had one for my EBRD job, but so I had another interview, and I have zero issues. You had to file all the papers again, all your financial holdings. I did all the paperwork, no problem. It's rather it's a big job. I'm sure it's torturous depending on what your holdings are, but bottom line, I had zero issues on that. And then it was a waiting game. And so I left my job with some regrets, but looking forward to what I thought would be an interesting confirmation process. I wouldn't say I was exceptionally ambitious for the position, but I could see the benefit of the platform. That is, I wanted to talk about things that I've long discussed in my writings about the need for money to serve as a reliable and honest measure and a dependable store of value. I thought that it would be nice to have the opportunity to speak about those issues. But in the meantime, I was told don't engage with the press because the senators you'll be interviewing with prefer that they have control over the dialogue. They will ask you their questions, and they don't want you to be accommodating the press ahead of their own interviews with you. And therefore, I realize you lose the ability to influence the narrative, and I was uncomfortable with that, but that was the advice I was getting. It seemed like it took too long to me for the actual hearing, but I guess I just wanted to move on with it. I was kind of in limbo. That took a few months from the summer of 2019 through the fall, but in January, I was formally nominated, and within a couple of weeks had my hearing before Senate Banking. I had my interviews with senators, some of whom I thought, well, I'll never get along with this person, like Sherrod Brown, but we had a great meeting in his office, and so it shows how naive I was. At the actual hearing, he was just vicious, I thought, and I thought, who is this person, and why did I walk out of there thinking I explained all of his questions, and then he turned around and I thought was quite brutal in his questioning and unfair. But my other conversations with both Democrats and Republicans were extremely gratifying, and I went into the hearing thinking, well, I guess some people are going to go through a kind of a vigorous attack. It seemed like there might be something sort of coordinated, but I'll just have to answer the best I can. My family, meantime, came in from Los Angeles the day before, including my mother, who was in her mid-90s, and my husband and brothers and sisters and family. So I felt that was great, but it was a little tough to sit there and be berated by some of these questions from senators. And then as you started to respond, they would say, and my time is up, and kind of hand it off to the next one.
Let me interrupt.
That's a very long answer, but that was the downside of the process.
Let me interrupt to tell you, as you know, and the audience that they can go back and watch this hearing. It's in the C-SPAN archives. And your point about Sherrod Brown, I think wasn't he the ranking member on the Democratic side?
Yes, that's right.
And so he starts off. He might have had more than 5 minutes. Sometimes the chairman and the ranking member have more than 5 minutes. But when he started laying down the things that he disagreed with you on, what was your reaction as you sat there?
I thought it went downhill so fast when the chairman of the committee, Chair Crapo from Idaho, first introduced me. That was fine, and I gave my statement. And he closed out his opening remarks by saying, I'm entering into the record a Wall Street Journal editorial, the lead editorial that had come out the prior day, entitled The War on Judy Shelton. And I thought, whoa, I guess he's entering that into the record. And it made me, it kind of had a chilling impact on me. I was very grateful for that editorial, but it reminded me how much of this judgment that was supposed to be left up to the senators thinking for themselves was being fought in the press. The editorials from the New York Times and from the Washington Post, I just thought were over the top. And I remember there was one making me out to be the gold bug, and which was seen as in the context of wacko and completely inappropriate for someone who might serve at our central bank. And since I had this long friendship with Alan Greenspan, I emailed it to him that morning. And I wrote something. It was his first line of a paper he'd written in 1966, which said, hysterical. There seems to be a hysterical antagonism toward anyone who talks favorably about the gold standard. And he wrote back within a couple hours. He emailed back that yes, he'd seen this, and he said these are really strange times. And if gold has nothing to do with being a monetary asset for the U.S. government, why does our government hold so much of it? And I thought, see, what the press doesn't understand, or people who try to caricature someone like myself, is that at the level of Greenspan or Volcker, or say my mentor would be Robert Mundell. These are, and I was a neighbor at the Hoover Institution down the hall from Milton Friedman. The real greats on monetary policy always talk about gold and about floating versus fixed rates and about what worked in prior international monetary systems and what is the role of gold, or do we need it, or can we get by with a pure fiat system? They speak easily about these issues, or about the Bretton Woods system for Paul Volcker, who always thought we were going to go back to something like that, a gold convertible, dollar anchored international monetary system. And I just thought it's ironic to me that these people who would judge my capabilities really have no sense of monetary history or the facility with which these issues are discussed at the very top level of people who actually do and have been in the arena experiencing the trade-offs in having a central bank manipulate the interest rate to exert economic outcomes versus having a very strict monetary rule through some level of gold convertibility. These are very scholarly and issues, and make for fascinating debates among true monetary specialists.
This is my observation. There's 7 members of the board of the Federal Reserve. Most of them, the average person, never heard of. And if you go into their backgrounds, almost all of them are academics at some point. Why did Chris Waller, who was sitting there at the table with you, they did not attack him. They didn't go after him in any way. Why did they pick you over him? And he is a Republican, as you were at the table. And do you have any theory on that?
Well, I think that I was an easier target. He's an exceptional researcher and really ran the research department for the St. Louis Fed. And I think actually they would have loved to have had James Bullard, who is the president of that district reserve branch of the Federal Reserve System. And he wasn't interested in the position, but Chris Waller was a very good surrogate for that way of thinking, which I would say, monetary policy is supposed to be nonpartisan, but I suppose that would come closest to saying a Republican president might prefer a James Bullard approach, which was then embodied in Chris Waller. I think Chris is quite good on his own count, but I think he was less controversial because there was someone who was already participating on the monetary policy decision-making committee meetings. That would be Bullard, who was his boss, as he was always quick to acknowledge. And he represented a view that was already being represented at the Federal Reserve versus, I guess, I was seen as more of a loose cannon.
Could you imagine? I mean, these are 14-year appointments. What do you think of that idea? And can you imagine yourself sitting there for 14 years where most of the publicity goes to the chairman?
Well, it's true. The 14-year term, I would have been fulfilling the rest of Janet Yellen's term. And they have such long terms because the Federal Reserve, when it was established in 1913, was meant to be somewhat insulated from political influence. And by having long staggered terms, I suppose just like judgeships, the idea is that you're not running to be reappointed. In a way, it doesn't make sense because the chair, who does have by far the most influence, has a 4-year term and does have to be go through the process every 4 years if they're going to be reappointed. They have to go back through the hearings. And so there are many actual aspects of Federal Reserve independence that when you look at them a little more closely, don't really pan out. For example, I might as well mention this at this point. The Fed likes to say that it's independent because it does not get its funding from Congress through the constitutional process of budgeting. That instead it lives off its own income, off of its own portfolio, because that's always been the case. But that is about to switch, I would say, in the next 6 months or so, if not sooner, because the Fed is going to be having to pay out more interest, which is because that's how it raises interest rates. It pays commercial banks and hedge funds not to take money out of their checking accounts at the Fed, and that's going to get more and more expensive for the Fed because we're talking about $5.6 trillion in cash sitting at the Fed on deposit that they're now going to be paying a significant amount of interest on. And at the same time, the Fed's portfolio is now delivering close to an amount of income to the Fed that will be lower than that. Therefore, they will have to turn to Treasury and say, you're going to have to cover our operating expenses. And that's going to be a new position for the Fed. And so I'm thinking there will be future discussions. Are they now not so independent? Because they do have to turn to the federal government to fund their operations. They also think they're insulated. I think the idea of Fed independence also has turned into a convenient excuse because the Fed does not criticize the budget priorities of Congress or pending legislation, even if it will exacerbate inflation potentially. They will not criticize the president. And then it's easy for Congress and the president to indulge in fiscal measures, knowing that if the Fed tries to counter it with high interest rates, they say, I won't criticize the Fed, I'm preserving its independence. So it becomes a mutually beneficial way for neither side to criticize the other.
One of the things I read is that people have tried over the years to find out how many, there's something like 23,000 people that work in the system. They don't work at the Fed headquarters, but you can't find out how much they make. Now, explain the relationship between the Federal Reserve banks to the Federal Reserve Board here in Washington, and should all that be transparent? And isn't it possible that the presidents of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or whatever makes more money than the Jay Powell does, which is about $203,000 a year?
Well, in fact, they do. The district bank presidents do make more money. I think that's public information. Maybe it's not easily available, but I'm certainly aware of it, but through public means. But yes, the district bank presidents are paid more than the members of the Board of Governors. So that may have even figured into his thinking. There are 400 PhD economists who work at the Fed. I did see an interesting study that showed that 90% of the employees of the Federal Reserve System vote Democrat. I thought that's interesting because there's been a lot of talk about the need for diversity at the Fed, and I think the only diversity that really matters is intellectual. I think the fixation on gender or race is very misplaced and extremely unhelpful, and sort of accomplishes the precise opposite result that one would hope for. Because then if you search for someone based on those superficial issues, it's almost as if you're saying, because if they have those, we know they're going to think a certain way. So for me, intellectual diversity and a way to get away from the groupthink at the Fed is much to be sought, and so that is an issue. But as far as the salaries, I don't think it's a secret, even though I don't know how easily accessible it is. You probably have to dig more. Certainly anyone who is put up for the position, their finances are laid out there for all the world to see. Every stock holding and every bit of compensation, including, I think, one makes all of $400 if you have a lead opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal. But I had to get that down to the penny. And so they really scrutinize your own finances and then put them out for public viewing. So about employees, I couldn't say other employees. I will say, you were asking about the process. We didn't get much beyond when I was successfully, but by the skin of the teeth, voted favorably out of that hearing.
13 and
even
12?
Though it was, the one on February 13th in 2020. So you can imagine that in the context of COVID, really shutting down government within the month. But even though it ended up being delayed, every Democrat voted against me, but there were 13 Republicans, and they voted for me, all of them. And there were 3 who'd had some reservations, but it turned out I met with each and spoke with each, and all of them, after speaking with me, voted for me on the Republican side. And so I was favorably reported, and now heading into full Senate confirmation. Because of COVID, at the time of the Senate vote, there were Senator Grassley, Senator Scott from Florida. They were out with COVID. They were both going to vote for me. Mitt Romney, who to this day I have no idea why he was against me. I graduated from the University of Utah. I had supported Mitt Romney when he ran for president. I thought my ideas would be very much aligned with his. He wouldn't meet with me. And he was asked, I think, to do something called pairing with Senator Grassley, who missed my vote. It was the first time in, I think, 20 years and 5,000 votes, some incredible numbers there, that he had to miss a vote because the night before the vote for me, he came down with COVID. And so I actually missed by one vote, because then McConnell had to reverse his vote in order to be able to bring my nomination up a second time. And I received a call from Vice President Pence later that day saying he was suited up and ready to break the tie, and was crushed that it hadn't worked out. I later learned that 2 of the Democrats, who of course voted against me, 2 senators from Connecticut, were also supposed to be quarantined under COVID, but they came to Washington anyway that day, voted against me, and also Kamala Harris, who had not voted since becoming the vice presidential nominee. She also flew down just to do the vote against me. So I felt that a lot of forces were aligned, and that they politicized my nomination far more than any statements or any positions I had taken. So that was also, I guess, disappointing for me to learn that those things had happened.
Well, you've been around a lot of these politics and things for a long time, and usually there's somebody, some organization that's behind this kind of thing. Somebody that's feeding the New York Times or the Washington Post, or vice versa if it's the Republicans. Did you ever find out who's behind so strongly opposing you?
I saw organizations. I would regularly see very, very nasty things said about me, and I would try to find out. I saw that some were being funded through grants from very large Democrat donors. Most disappeared. The websites that were tweeting and writing things, I later, within the next year, you would just get a empty website, discontinued. So I don't know about that. I will say I was distressed to see when, I met with Jay Powell. It hadn't been scheduled, but of course during my orientation, I spent days at the Federal Reserve, really enjoyed it, met with the other members of the Board of Governors, and was told, we welcome you here, we need you here. I felt I would have a great reception, and was already getting involved in some of the issues before the Fed, and everyone seemed very forthcoming. One day when I was doing one of those orientation days, suddenly they said, your schedule's changed, and Jay Powell would like to meet with you. I said, great, and it was scheduled for 5 minutes. I think we spoke closer to 40, and he asked how it was going, and at first I thought he seemed slightly wary. He says, how do you feel about your upcoming hearing? And I think I laughed and said, I'm terrified, and he laughed. And but what I later saw, when Powell was questioned on various occasions during his normal testimony before Congress, a Democrat congresswoman said, "Oh, what do you think about Judy Shelton?" And he said, "Well, of course I couldn't comment on a candidate," but then he proceeded to malign what he thought were my views on a gold standard and said the Fed, if they had adopted a gold standard, could no longer try to have price stability and maximum employment. It would only be targeting the price of gold. I've never said that. I've actually said having a gold price rule would be a mistake. So I thought, I don't. What do you do when the chair of the Fed mischaracterizes your position? At the same time, they're saying they're not commenting. And then I saw, because the chairman's schedule is released months after concurrent events, he made a number of phone calls to senators on the day before and the day of that hearing, when my name was being put before the entire Senate for confirmation, including he called Mitt Romney rather late the night before. And it was Mitt Romney who then refused to pair when Grassley ended up catching COVID and it becoming public that night and the next morning that he would be missing my vote. And I wondered, when Romney did the very discourteous maneuver of refusing to pair, that is, I guess in the Senate, if two senators in the same party, if one, for some reason beyond his control, can't vote, then one who was going to vote the opposite way as a courtesy also doesn't vote, so that it's just neutralized. He wouldn't do that. For the longest serving member of the Senate, he wouldn't do that for Grassley. And I wondered why reporters didn't look into this flurry of calls between Chairman Powell. There were so many rumors that somehow President Trump wanted me to replace the chairman and was going to pull some maneuver by elevating me. That was never discussed between myself and the president or anyone in the White House. I found it outlandish to suggest and damaging to suggest because it might influence senators. And at bottom line, I don't know if Powell believed that in some way, but I wondered if he didn't quietly lobby against me. And if I'm wrong, I apologize, but I have reason to think that he made a personal call on Romney's cell phone, and I wondered why people didn't pursue that line of inquiry, because I think that would have been very improper, as he had acknowledged, to influence the process in any way. There was another Republican, Lamar Alexander, who didn't vote against me, but didn't vote for me. And I saw right after the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial saying, I hope when Shelton's nomination comes up again before Trump was voted out, so that couldn't be an issue anymore. But before the inauguration of President Biden, my name could come up again and be voted on. And it wasn't clear if Alexander would vote for me or against me at that point. The Journal urged him to vote for me. And I saw within 3 days of that, he had a private lunch with Chairman Powell at the Fed. And looking at phone records, in 2 years, I saw only one senator was invited to a private lunch at the Fed. So maybe it's coincidence, but I really wondered if there was some lobbying from the Fed among senators, and I just wish reporters had been more curious, because it would set a terrible, terrible precedent for future nominees.
How much of this was really about Donald Trump?
This is I guess a yes and no. I like to think it was. I like to think it was about Trump, in the sense that I don't think I was seen as if my views are partisan, it's only for pro-growth programs, which tend to be promoted more by Republicans, in the sense that I don't think it's all about monetary policy. I think the Fed's job is to provide a stable monetary foundation, but I think trade policy, energy policy, and particularly the fiscal measures of lower taxes and less regulation, I think those are extremely influential in terms of promoting productive economic growth. And so I do strongly carry and have long discussed in my own writings the importance of those views. But I don't think I've been particularly politically active when asked. I have, provided advice or counsel to candidates, but I'm not a political activist per se. I always thought I had a scholarly approach, and it's the academic reasoning that impresses me more than any political lobbying when it comes to legislation.
What would you say if somebody called you in the future and says, I've just been nominated for a particular position, or maybe even before then? What would you say in the way of warning them of the negative part of all this?
I don't know if other people would have my experience. I think you have to be open-minded if you're interested in public service, if you're willing to go through the crucible of the process. I think you should definitely follow your heart and do it. I wouldn't be scared off. At the same time, you have to later decide whether you're reconciled to not being able to defend yourself, because I felt my reputation was just being dragged through the mud, and there I was, wanting to be a good nominee and not engage, and yet I had one expert who was a spokesman for Treasury, in fact, who said to me, no one will defend you. In fact, you do need to defend yourself no matter what they tell you. But I decided that in the end, if I made it through and I was able to serve, that would be far more important. Then I would have a chance to show what I think as someone who's now involved in the process. And I have great respect for people who are in the arena and involved in the process. And I would state my views, but I also understand why the Fed seeks consensus and the importance of having messaging to the public about forward guidance that's meaningful and not all over the place. I think I would have been a team player, but at the same time, in private discussions at the Fed, would have asserted my views fairly strongly. So I would encourage anyone to say be prepared for the slings and arrows. But in the end, and again, why I say overall it was a positive experience, during my hearing, the line of which I'm most proud was one senator said, I know you've been responding to very leading questions this morning, and he said, and I hope you realize much of it's been orchestrated, but he goes, I just want to give you a moment to say, what do you believe in? And I was able to say, I believe in the constitutional responsibility for the integrity of U.S. currency, everything that's stated, that the currency is supposed to be a measure. It's stated in the same line, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that defines Congress having the ability to lay out what the official weights and measures would be for our nation. It's in the same sentence, and to define to regulate the money. And so it was seen as likewise a measure that people would use to plan their lives and their endeavors. So I went back to that and was able to say in my hearing, so if people go back and watch the hearing, they'll see a lot of fireworks. But I did have a chance to say that I see money as a moral contract between the government and its citizens. And that is the view I would wish to take into my service as a member of the Board of Governors, should the Senate decide to confirm me.
As I was watching the hearings, there was a gentleman over your left shoulder who had a little gray beard, and I was guessing that's your husband.
I'm guessing you're right, and I think it was hard on him to hear some of these things. But probably at one point, when I was being goaded by Senator Brown, he said, "Are you going to take orders from President Trump on how you're going to vote?" And I think I said, "No one tells me what to do." I later thought I should have made a carve out. Well, my husband does have some influence there. He's someone I would always listen to. But I wanted to strongly make the point that I think everyone has a right to criticize the Fed, but I think members who get to that point, and certainly I consider myself someone as being fully capable of making my own decisions, and no one could possibly dictate to me how I would respond on any vote coming before me as a monetary policymaker.
When did you know you weren't going to get it?
Honestly, not until when were the elections in Georgia? January 5th, I guess. I thought there was still a strong chance that my name, that they would vote again. And the Trump administration did resubmit my nomination, which they have to do after the close of the year. They had to resubmit any open nominations upon which action had not yet been taken, and my name was resubmitted as a candidate. But when the Georgia election took off 2 Republican senators, I thought, well, that's the end.
By the way, you mentioned this earlier, the 5-minute rule in the Senate. We've done it for years. We've been doing this for 43 years. When you watch it, the 5-minute rule comes up every time somebody testifies. You watch the members begin to push to get an answer quicker. I just want a yes or a no. What's it feel like sitting in the chair when you know they only have 5 minutes? Well,
I guess you get a little bit cynical as you get used to it, because some of them spend 4 minutes and 40 seconds making a speech that may or may not have much to do with the issues at hand in terms of your suitability to serve on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. some of it, I would say, is a form of bullying, which I wouldn't mind if I thought it was honest intellectual discussion. But if you're pressed into yes or no, without being able to explain your reasoning or given a hypothetical that you first have to wrap your mind around and say, wait, what are you suggesting? Because if you're saying there's this and this, what about this and that? And they're just saying, nope, what would you do? And I thought without context, you find yourself kind of backing up. And then the next thing you know, there's some pithy statement and it's over. But that was demoralizing. I did find myself in that position a couple of times and thought maybe I should have handled this better. Sometimes I didn't see it coming, and maybe that threw me. But then when I would hear a softball question pitched to my colleague, I just thought, what is going on here? And but again, you have to just kind of like in a tennis match, I guess, slough off what just happened and gear up for the next question and be back to saying, yes, Senator, thank you for the opportunity, and here's what I would do. So I kept trying to redo it, and amazingly to myself, when it was over, I felt good about it because I knew it had been what would later be called contentious or bloodbath, or I saw various write-ups of my hearing even that day on CNBC. But in my own mind, I knew I could not have done better. That is, I knew in my heart I had done the very best I could. I'd brought my best effort, and I had a sense of being grateful for the opportunity. I really did. Even though I remember Senator Warren, the night before, she would ask me to answer 15 questions at a time when I'm preparing for the hearing, and her letter demanding answers would be leaked to the Post before I was even given a copy. And then I'd be getting reporters calling saying, what do you think of the statement by Senator Warren? And I would be like, what statement, what letter? So I guess the tactics made me a little bit, as I say, cynical about some of the theatrics and the maneuvering by politicians. But still, it was an experience from which I learned a lot, and probably, I guess I'll sound like I don't know, goody two shoes, but I really do believe things work out for a reason. And maybe doors opened that maybe I would have had to be more circumspect as a member of the Board of Governors. And now I feel I'm somewhat liberated to say things I really believe in the interests of our nation's future and for the sake of, I hope, more sound money and sound finances as we go forward.
Couple quick technical questions on the process. Of the 25 members of the committee, how many would not meet with you? I think all of them were willing to meet with me. It was Romney was not on the committee. He was just a senator at large. He's not a member of the Senate Banking Committee. So the ones who were members of the committee, those meetings were scheduled for me, and I had sort of a liaison assigned by the Federal Reserve, and so I was always accompanied by someone who would take me to these meetings and arrange these meetings, who was an employee of the Federal Reserve, as well as then I would be met at the office by someone representing the Presidential Personnel Office who nominated me. So those were all set up. And, I mean, I welcomed it, but those were scheduled by other forces beyond my personal involvement. And so I was unaware of anyone. I think anyone who wanted to meet with me, I certainly was eager to meet with. And I'm not aware of, I don't think it's ever put to them to refuse. It was only after I had been voted out of committee and was going before the Senate that apparently there was a very strong effort to have me meet with Mitt Romney. Larry Kudlow told me he personally asked
and was turned down. I even called my old friend Paul Ryan, who'd been his vice presidential running mate with Romney, and said, I don't understand why Romney would be opposed to me. Do you have any way, could you prevail upon him? But I think his answer was more that he wasn't so close to Romney anymore, and that he didn't have a way to make that happen.
The last question on process. I know this has started to happen a number of years ago, and I just wondered if it was recommended to you or it was just your natural way of doing things, but you would thank each senator for the question. You would say, thank you, Senator, for that question. This is something when we started, again, years ago, that people didn't do, and I wonder if this is something that people are advising nominees for these kind of positions.
Yes, it's overly, I don't care for that. I doubt that I would ever go before a nominating committee, a nomination hearing committee again. I would not be that way. I felt grateful to have been nominated. As I say, I considered it an honor. So when I was being advised, they even have mock sessions to help you practice. You are told that all that matters is being polite and almost subservient. And every response to every question, it's rote. Thank you for that question, Senator. I found it a bit sickening, to tell you the truth. And but nevertheless, as a candidate, I felt because they asked us to behave that way, and that was expected, and that our only goal was not to antagonize the senators by doing anything other than being courteous to the max, that I must follow that policy, and even that when you're faced with insulting questions from in my case the Democratic senators for the most part, that the Republican senators would mark you down if you were rude to their compatriots in that committee, that it wouldn't be welcomed by the Republican side either if you were anything less than scrupulously polite to the senators and responding automatically with thank you for that question, Senator so-and-so, was required.
We're running out of time.
I'm normally not that obsequious, Brian. Polite, but not obsequious.
I started to say that back in 1989 when I first met you and we sat down for a Booknotes interview, we were talking about the Soviet Union, and this was 89. Keep that in mind. I'm going to run a clip of what you said then, and I want you to respond.
What do you think of the Soviet Union?
I think that it's an idea that went wrong. Economically, I think it's doomed. I don't say that with glee. I've only been to the Soviet Union on one occasion for a couple of weeks. I liked it very much. I was treated very nicely. In some ways, I'm probably a closet Slavophile. I like the Russian language. I work at it every day. I like Russian literature.
Now, I've since heard you talk about the fact you've been back there several more times. What's your reaction of what you said in '89, and what's happening?
Well, I would restate that I love the language and the literature, and I do read or watch something in Russian every day. What's changed is it's become more clear that even though the Soviet Union itself collapsed, if you still have the same mindset and have a dictator running the country and imposing economic order as he sees fit and prioritizing the military as he sees fit, that this is not going to serve the interests of the people. When I was at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, it was extremely fulfilling and interesting for me because that bank was started in 1991 as a response by Western nations to provide the means to finance a transition for the failing Soviet Union, soon to crash and be dissolved and disappear forever, to take those 15 newly independent republics that were formerly part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, to move them toward democratic institutions and free market economies. So in my role, I wanted to do that, but it turned out by 2014, Russia had already invaded Ukraine and taken Crimea. So then I wanted to end loans, and lucky for me, the bank also wanted to end new lending to Russia. That is now going on at hyper levels. The EBRD is helping Ukraine. And I just spoke yesterday, in fact, with the Biden nominee for my former position, and we had a wonderful conversation. I said, this is exquisitely nonpartisan. You're just looking out for U.S. interests, and you're going to have to fight for them at the EBRD. But already Europe is learning that you shouldn't depend on Russia for your energy supplies, and that was a message that I worked on very hard during my service. And I wished him well, and I think he'll do quite well, I hope. But meantime, the lead economist for the EBRD was a brilliant Russian guy named Sergei Guriev. He's fearless. He had to flee Russia. He was one of the up-and-coming top economists. Putin knew well who he was, and he was involved in testifying about whether the government's case against Khodorkovsky was justified, and he found objectively it was not. The next thing he knew, he and his family were being harassed, and he thought he might even get arrested. Well, he ended up coming to France. I got to know him in my role at the National Endowment for Democracy, and he then took on the position of being chief economist for the EBRD. He has since left, and now is the most fearless person in saying there really is a true Russia of real Russians who don't go along with Putin, and we blame ourselves that he's still in power, and we're doing our best. And this guy's a supporter of Navalny and some of the opposition activists who would like to counter the autocratic approach taken by Putin and the people close to him. So there are some wonderful, brave Russian individuals, so I'll never malign Russia as a country, even though I very much oppose and resent what it's doing to the world, and particularly to Ukraine.
One other clip from that 1989 interview, it kind of looks at it from the other side of the between Russia and the West.
The United States bears the brunt of the defense burden of the West. So to U.S. citizens and to our leaders, it appears as if at the same time we are protecting Europe through our NATO commitment, they're undercutting us by giving this economic succor to the Soviet Union, which certainly enhances the total amount of resources available to the Soviet Union, and tapping into what I said earlier about the military sector always having a priority claim on resources. I think in the United States we feel that the Europeans are contributing to Soviet military potential, and we have to then match that concurrently in defense costs to match any new escalation of Soviet military capabilities.
Your reaction to what you said 33 years ago?
It makes me more angry that the efforts of the U.S. office, of which I headed at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and let me just say this bank provides billions in infrastructure financing to those former Soviet Republic nations and a slew of other nations. And the U.S. is the largest contributor of capital. We have 10% of the capital. And yet the case that I kept trying to make on behalf of the United States, that Europe was too dependent on Nord Stream 2, the pipeline. And I will say EBRD put $2 billion toward the Southern Gas Corridor, which would be an alternative way to deliver energy to Europe. But nevertheless, the German director and the European Union directors felt that somehow this was just a U.S. fixation. We could have financed liquefied natural gas facilities to receive exports from the United States. We were energy independent and willing to sell LNG to Europe at what would become an increasingly efficient, more viable long-term cost to Europe. But they seemed unwilling to give up this reliance on Russia. And even though I think now it's clear that was a grave mistake, and they're all going to pay a terrible price, I'm anticipating a difficult winter in terms of fueling expense in Europe. That was a case where I couldn't get enough allies to join me in countervailing the weight of the votes put forward by the directors from Europe.
Economist Judy Shelton, we are out of time. Thank you for Nominee 101 in the background on your nomination. We appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Brian. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.